If you can't say no, you don't have a right. In property rights in the law, the way that you define property is that which you can say no to someone else about, basically. If you can deny someone else access to something, then you own it. That's the definition of property. And that kind of makes sense. Like, you get to say where your car goes and where your car does not go. You get to decide who has access to your cell phone and who does not. If you can't control the not side, you don't own it. You can have access to something, including when you rent it, but the ability to say no, that's where the perimeter of a right starts to form. And if you don't have a right to not buy something, then you really don't have economic rights in a meaningful sense. One thing that surprised me about law school is how often I agree with the court decisions. I will read through the decision, and even if I do disagree, I'll be able to say, that was well made. I can respect the logic in it, I can see the internal consistency, and I can say, you know, most of the time, under most circumstances, the case law that I read seems to be founded on good principles, or at least it seems to be reasonable. There is an exception. A number of times in the Supreme Court's history, it's made grave mistakes. One example of this is Plessy versus Ferguson, which created the idea of separate but equal. Basically said that you can have a whites-only section and a blacks-only section, they just have to be relatively equal. We know how well that turned out. It's a terrible idea. Fortunately, that one has been repealed. But there is another case which hasn't been. This is a case from the 1940s called Wickard v. Filburn. And when I first read this case, I only had one conclusion. It's evil. I don't mean ill-founded, I mean that as well. I mean evil. It infringes on rights that I think are incredibly important. Basically, the circumstance is this. During the 1930s, America was playing an experiment in fascism under the New Deal. And I mean that in the technical sense. There were a lot of songs in the 1930s that praised Mussolini, for instance, in the United States. And we're into this idea of centralizing the government and idolizing our nation and having kind of this central nation-state organizing things. We were playing with state-controlled industries. And one of the things that we created was a bureau that defined how much wheat was going to be produced by the country so that we could institute price controls. And the way that happened is we had a centralized person who defined how much the price of wheat was going to be. That's based on supply and demand, of course, so we have to keep the supply low enough that the price is high based on the anticipated demand. So goes the theory. So they would create the number. This is the number of how much wheat we're going to produce. Then that got distributed to all of the states. The states then got to disperse that number that they're allowed to produce down to their counties, which then got dispersed down to their farmers. And then that was the opposite of a quota. This is how much the farm was allowed to produce, and if it went over, the farm had to pay fines. Well, under the United States Constitution, there is the Article 1 powers. Basically, Congress is not allowed to make laws that don't fit on the list. The list is quite broad. It includes things like interstate commerce, it includes things like the national currency, the budgeting powers. There's lots of powers here, but if it's not on the list, Congress isn't allowed to do it. And so there was a question about the authority under which they were able to make this law. They said, well, it's about interstate commerce. We're regulating commerce, price controls, this is the way we get to do it. Now there's this farmer who runs a farm, and he grows more wheat than he's supposed to under this quota. And as such, a fine is levied against him. And he says, wait a minute, I was not going to sell any of this wheat. This wheat is for my use. I feed my chickens with this wheat. I feed myself with this wheat. None of this wheat was ever going to leave the perimeter of my farm. In other words, I wasn't going to trade it, so commerce isn't involved. And it was not going to cross any state lines. Like, there's no interstateness about this. So how is it under the Interstate Commerce Clause power that you are regulating and levying this fine against me? Why does this quota apply to me if I'm not going to sell a single grain of it? And the Supreme Court argued and said, well, you know, he says he's only going to use it for himself. And maybe they could have argued that he had it, he might have sold it anyway. That's not the reasoning they used. They said he had to pay the fine, and the reason was that by withdrawing himself from the economy, he he was affecting the demand side of the supply and demand equation. And since they were trying experimental price controls, that meant that, well, if he withdraws himself from the demand side, and if enough people withdraw themselves from the demand side, then, well, then we won't be able to do this thing, and so we need to be able to enforce consumption. In other words, you cannot withdraw yourself from the demand side. And the government has a legal right, after this case, to create laws which force consumption. And I think that's evil. Plain and simple. There is something so fundamental about a right to be your own person, to provide for yourself, a right to not participate, a right to not buy. I did a video recently on why make things from scratch, why do that, and I talk about this distinction between which thing to get and whether to get the thing. So that is a completely separate choice. And what Wickard v. Filburn seems to suggest, what it explicitly says, is that the government has a right to demand that you are restricted to the which option. You can be forced to buy something, forced to participate in the economy. This is closely related to the medieval practice of thurlage. The definition of a serf in one way, the relationship was complicated. Basically, there were a number of rights and obligations between lords and serfs. Serfs were bonded to the land. They could be kind of bought and sold with the land. It's complicated, but one of the things that defines a serf is that a lord can demand and make it a rule in his fief that serfs had to use a centralized mill to mill their grain. Because grain is the staple of life and it's kind of what you live on, it's like the bulk of most of your food, particularly if you're in the lower rungs, you are forced to consume at the mill. And because the mill takes a fee from your grain, you are forced to participate in the economy. In Scotland, for instance, where this practice of thurlage, and thurling your serfs, or your thralls, related to the same word, in English there's a similar word, churl. Shakespeare uses it as an insult to say that you're like this low-down person, you churl, because a churl is somebody who is enthralled, similar word. You weren't allowed to own your own grain mill. You had to use the centralized mill. In Scotland, when they're archaeologically digging up cornstones, when they find a cornstone, they're usually broken, because a mill owner and the lord, who had kind of instantiated this mill owner as the guy that you had to get your grain ground by, could go into a home and say, oh, you have a cornstone, and they had a legal right to smash it to enforce your dependence. That's wrong. That's deeply, deeply wrong, and I don't like it. And unfortunately, Wickard v. Filburn does that. It in a sense enthralls the people of the United States of America, because even if they're not practicing it, the government has asserted a right through that case to enforce consumption in the exact same way that serfs were enthralled to the local mill. I think the right to say no or to opt out, even to your own detriment. I mean, a mill is better than a hand quern. No question about it. Well, some question about it, because the value of independence is worth a lot. But without the option of having a hand quern and doing it the slower, more backbreaking way that does save you money in terms of how much grain is going to go to the mill owner, you're not free. And freedom is worth a lot. I think this case is an incredibly bad precedent. It's awful. And unfortunately, it is still good law in the sense that it is still enforced, still on the books. It's still something that the present-day Supreme Court will use as precedent to make future decisions. In addition to the rights aspect of Wickard v. Filburn and the ability to say no, I'm not going to buy any wheat. I'm going to provide for my own needs in wheat. There's a problem in the logic that the court used. So the court said, well, if you withdraw yourself from the economy in that regard and just don't buy wheat anymore, then we won't be able to calculate the demand for how much wheat there will be, because maybe everybody makes their own wheat. Maybe nobody buys wheat anymore. Then how are we going to institute price controls in terms of the farmers who are making wheat to sell to other people? It affects the economy, and so it affects interstate commerce, and therefore we get to regulate it. Well, what if they started just eating corn? The thing about wheat is it has great gluten structure, and so it makes good bread. This is the reason why it's kind of the key grain in the Western diet, or at least it was until we stopped really eating grains. But what if you just ate corn? suddenly the demand for wheat goes down because your need for grains has been filled, and you can't really account for that because maybe you can still grow your own corn, except Wickard v. Filburn affects that too. So this is really far-reaching, and it's bad logic at its core. It's basically saying that if we need to control something in order to affect this calculation that we're thinking we can make at a centralized level, then you can't do the thing, or we can regulate the thing. But fundamentally, it is a thing that cannot be calculated. It can't. You can fill that same need with potatoes, with starches, with all kinds of other things. The demand side, unless you're going to force people to eat it, there's no way to control demand side, fundamentally, unless you can choose whether or not you're going to buy the thing or what you're interested in buying. I believe in a right of opting out. And I think you need to have that right of opting out in order to be able to opt in a way that makes sense, in order for that choice to be given meaning. If you want to participate, that's good. I encourage participation. I want to see young entrepreneurs working in the economy. I want to see people contributing and serving and helping their community. But I don't think that that has any meaning unless you have the right not to. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button below. And if you're interested in topics that wrestle with themes of value theory and also with independence and also with making things from scratch, then please hit the subscribe button below. Thank you very much.